conflict in the world, and I recently got right up to the front lines in the cockpit of an F-16.
So this is about the north edge of the airspace. We're about 7 miles from the North Korean border right here.
So this is as far as you can go without provoking a war?
Yep.
President Trump is in Da Nang, Vietnam today as part of his continuing trip to Asia. He spoke this morning to business executives at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation fairly in international trade. But now the president said the U.S. will set trade policy under the guideline of America First. So far in Asia, President Trump has been getting fairly positive reviews. He's looked presidential, and he didn't, despite some early concerns, trigger a trade war with China or a nuclear war with North Korea. I spoke earlier with a source who has direct knowledge of the details of the trip. He told me that the president's advisors worked hard to tone down the speech he made here in South Korea. But I don't think we're out of the woods yet. Not by a long shot. In fact, if you listen to what our president said, it's clear we're on a collision course. The president said repeatedly and in the strongest terms possible that North Korea must disarm, that it must stop developing nuclear weapons or face military consequences. He said every step North Korea takes to advance its nuclear weapons makes the regime less safe. But North Korea shows no sign of disarming. So this has become a game of chicken over weapons of mass destruction. We have been down this road before. But this time, the consequences are more serious than anything most, if any of us, have ever experienced. We're talking about the possibility of a nuclear war in our lifetimes, or at least of a conventional war that could spread across Asia. What are the chances of this actually happening? Well, a retired four-star general told me he thinks there's a 51% chance of war with North Korea before next summer. Even if that's too high, even if it's 10%, the risk is not zero. No way. And if this does break out, this city is in big trouble because right now, all the time, in fact, North Korea has thousands of rockets and artillery pieces pointed here. If the North Korean regime feels threatened, if it feels it's being driven from power, it can, and military experts say it probably would, destroy Seoul. And the South Koreans, the 25 million people living in this city, can't do much about it. They're stuck between Kim Jong-un on one side, who's determined to have a nuclear weapon program, and President Trump, who wants to take it away. You can imagine how it makes people pretty nervous here, especially this week, when President Trump arrived in Asia with an armada, and while the military here is in high gear.
Ninja 01, just verify your number 1.
Copy.
Ninja 2 is going to split off right now. VFR coming to you.
That is a firm.
Here at Osan, they've been preparing for war for more than 6 decades.
We have no BFM airspace.
This is the closest airbase to North Korea, so if war breaks out, it will be both a key launch pad for American firepower and an obvious target for incoming fire from the north. I joined Captain Kyle Moses, a.k.a. the Beast,
Climb up the ladder.
All right, on a mission to one of the most dangerous spots on the planet.
All right, watch your elbows. Canopy's coming down.
The demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea. The North Koreans have been threatening to shoot U.S. planes out of the sky, so even a routine mission is dangerous now.
Ground Traps 1, ready in sequence, 9 left. Traps 1, clear for takeoff.
Visor down. Seat is armed. Here we go.
And it doesn't take long for Captain Moses to demonstrate why they call him the Beast.
All right, get ready for some G here.
After takeoff, he puts us straight into a roll. The plane takes on up to 9 times the force of gravity, or 9G.
Wow.
How's that?
That was intense.
Yeah.
As we reach the front lines, Captain Moses positions his F-16 very carefully.
So this is about the north edge of the airspace. We're about 7 miles from the North Korean border right here.
So this is as far as you can go without provoking a war?
Yep.
Now, can we look into North Korea?
Oh, yeah. Over those mountains there, you can see into North Korea there.
So Is that where all their artillery is and all those rockets?
Oh, yeah.
If you were called into aggressive action, would that be possibly a target?
Yeah, that could definitely be something we could go after.
We head back to Osan.
Press 1, clear to land, 9 left.
Another routine patrol ending, thankfully, without incident. The pace here is relentless. Captain Moses' 36th Squadron flies F-16s, but the base is also home to modernized U-2 spy planes that depart on 12-hour flights at high altitude, keeping a constant watch on the enemy to the north. For months now, the U.S. military has been quietly beefing up its presence in the region, and we've been following every step. In August, joint drills with the South Koreans suddenly took on a whole new urgency. The enemy is left unnamed, but it's clear which battle they're rehearsing for. In September, we watched as American troops moved a battery of THAAD missiles, the most advanced missile interceptors in the world, into position. Missile defense systems aren't just about defense. They give those who have them the ability to attack and survive a counterattack. And while the THAAD has not yet been used against real incoming missiles, it adds another layer of protection to the extensive missile defense system already in place. Then, just a couple of weeks ago, what the president called an armada arrived in the peninsula. 3 aircraft carrier strike groups capable of sustaining a prolonged air campaign. Military experts believe all this hardware is not just here for show.
We're actually dealing with potential outcomes by next summer of all-out war, with millions displaced and hundreds of thousands killed and wounded.
Retired 4-star General Barry McCaffrey is a decorated veteran of war. He says that in the case of North Korea, there are no good options.
There are military options. They're all bad. If we went in with a massive conventional air and sea attack aimed at their nuclear capacity, we'd get 95% of it in the first 72 hours. But we wouldn't get all of it, or we wouldn't be sure. And that would probably trigger a very high-intensity conflict in the Korean Peninsula. The consequences of us attacking North Korea first would be dire.
But the alternative to military action, known in Washington as strategic patience, has become for the president a symbol of all the mistakes of the past.
The era of strategic patience is over.
A view echoed by some of the president's backers.
Patience is not an option with the U.S. homeland in the nuclear shadow of Kim Jong-un.
Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican from Colorado, says strategic patience is just another name for a do-nothing approach.
If your kids are at the table and they're throwing food around at each other, do you just sit back and wait? I'm going to strategically wait until they stop.
But this
or
isn't
do you
a food
actually
fight.
say
This
something
is a
about it? This is far more
potential
serious.
fight.
What we get with patience is a nuclear program in North Korea. What we got with patience is a launching of ballistic missiles.
We also got to all survive. We also are here, and there is still a Korean peninsula.
Well, if people believe they can trust Kim Jong-un, and that's why we have to make sure that he doesn't have that ability.
And those weapons would likely be used first on our South Korean allies.
Most of the enemy forces are located here. 70% of their fires are...
As Defense Secretary James Mattis was reminded when he recently visited the demilitarized zone. Mattis did his best to reassure his hosts.
Our goal is not war, but rather the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
It's a tricky message he was trying to deliver, that the U.S. is ready for war with North Korea while trying to avoid it at all cost. It's the same message the military has been trying to send too.
I know a lot about the Joint Chiefs and who they are. They're very responsible, cautious men. This generation all grew up in warfare. Old guys never want to fight.
But while the generals in uniform and in the cabinet have been cautious, the president has at times been flat out threatening.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen.
I think the president is more of a New York city hustler. So he's learned some lessons that are not applicable in international relations or international security.
General McCaffrey is an outspoken critic of the president.
There's an element of disbelief on the part of many of us who have seen combat at close range to see him so lightly dealing with these topics.
The president has made it clear he will continue to elevate the pressure on North Korea until its leader, Kim Jong-un, steps back from the brink. The problem is that the 33-year-old North Korean leader, the third in a family dynasty that has wielded absolute power over the country for nearly 70 years, does not seem to be yielding. He sees his nuclear program as a source of national pride and the right to keep it as a matter of life and death. So the more our president vows to end it, the more tests Kim conducts. Senator Gardner dismisses the North Korean leader as a madman who needs reining in by force if necessary.
Well, I think most people agree that Kim Jong-un is a whack job.
You call him a whack job. They call you a man mixed with human dirt who has lost the basic judgment and body hair.
Yeah, it doesn't like my haircut. I didn't know if that was an Onion headline or if it was actually real.
The point is, we're not in the schoolyard. The consequences are real.
They are, and that's why we continue to make sure that we have these tools that we must use to change the situation.
President Trump said of President Kim at the UN General Assembly, and I quote, "The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea." Rocket Man
is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
The regime responded by calling our president a deranged dotard. Is that really the way two world leaders should be conducting diplomacy over such sensitive issues?
I would have said something different in front of the United Nations, but I think it's very important. In the past,
as we've got a president of the United States who is publicly taunting and mocking a 33-year-old squirrely dictator with a nuclear program. It's an adolescent kind of way of dealing with a problem. Why would we ridicule a person that quixotic, that volatile? What good could possibly come from that?
I imagine that President Trump probably has access to CIA psychological profiles of Kim Jong-un, and I'm sure it probably says somewhere in that profile, probably in red letters, do not insult this person.
Suzanne DiMaggio uses more diplomatic tones. She's been involved in back-channel negotiations with the North Koreans for a couple of years now.
We're stuck in an escalating war of words, and we have to get out of it.
A real war?
Absolutely. If it's not managed well, this is how you slide into war. This is how you sleepwalk into war.
And you think we're sleepwalking into war now?
I think it's possible.
Her last meeting was in Moscow less than a month ago on the sidelines of a nuclear non-proliferation conference. And there was no doubt about the message from the North Korean envoy, Chae Sun-hui.
She said that nuclear weapons were the only way they saw to safeguard their regime from us. She made it very clear that they are going to proceed full steam ahead with their nuclear and missile program.
What would get the North Koreans to sit down on the table and actually negotiate?
I think once they feel that they can declare that they have a nuclear balance of power with the United States, then they'll be ready to negotiate. I don't think the U.S. has tried diplomacy in a way that warrants even contemplating a military response at this point.
But DiMaggio is not the one calling the shots. The president is. And during his trip, he delivered a clear threat to the North Korean leader.
Do not underestimate us, and do not try us.
Speaking before South Korea's National Assembly, the president carefully read a pre-prepared speech. There were no casual insults, but he was delivering a deadly ultimatum.
The regime has interpreted America's past restraint as weakness. This would be a fatal miscalculation.
The grave language is appropriate because any miscalculation here would be fatal. to thousands, maybe millions of people. As the president departed, both Americans and South Koreans were left wondering which side was going to blink first, and at what cost. That cost in human life could be astronomical. Tom Brokaw is going to be on the show a little later to remind us what we're talking about when we talk about nuclear weapons. But first, when the president landed here in Seoul, we went out on the streets to see what kind of welcome he was driving into. Traditionally, South Koreans have welcomed Americans, servicemen and presidents alike, warmly. But things are changing here. We found another equally passionate crowd. They were here to tell the American president to go home.
If Kim Jong-un or Trump decided to make war in Korean Peninsula, there's nothing we can do. It's a crazy thing.
Stay with us. Welcome back to On Assignment. President Trump is used to being a divisive figure. He's even used to low approval numbers. But here in South Korea, his numbers are especially harsh. Only 17% of those asked in a recent poll said they had confidence in him. That's a 71-point drop from Obama standing here. Of course, South Koreans don't get a vote on who becomes the president of the United States, but they do have strong opinions on that. Opinions they aired the day President Trump landed here. When President Trump rolled into Seoul, crowds lined the streets. Many were here to welcome the president with open arms, American flags, and a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn early night?
Traditionally, South Koreans have welcomed Americans, servicemen and presidents alike, warmly.
We believe United States, and we love United States.
But things are changing here. Just across the street, we found another equally passionate crowd. They were here to tell the American president to go home. Police officers cordoned off the protesters who tried to surge forward. President Trump is expected to pass by here any minute. The police have just started to push in, trying to keep the protesters back. They don't want them to block the president's path. But things soon calmed down again. This was not a violent crowd. You're holding a sign? Yep. What does it say?
It says, peace, not war.
Peace, not war.
Yep.
Soo-yeon Jung is 29 years old. She's one of the leaders of the protest.
In here, there are lots of students, university students, who doesn't want Donald Trump visiting Korea.
The divide is striking. Those waving the American flags are generally older. Those holding up the no Trump, no war signs tend to be much younger.
The younger generation here, they're not so interested in North Korea because they haven't grown up with it in their lives. The older generation, they remember when it was just Korea, or the Japanese colonial era, for example. So they have more of a direct sense of, you know, there was one country and now we're divided.
Daniel Tudor came here as a teacher, but fell in love with South Korea. He now runs a chain of bars that serve craft beer. He says for the older generation, there is a sense of unfinished business with North Korea.
I think probably for that generation, if you're of that age, you might think, well, why don't we just get this done? You know, in my lifetime, I want to see this over, regardless of what happens.
The memory of the bitter war between North and South defines the Korean Peninsula in a profound way. No one here disputes the fact that it was a massive influx of U.S. troops that saved South Korea from falling into communist hands. For generations, gratitude for that and for the protection that U.S. troops still stationed here 64 years after the end of the fighting defined this country. Not anymore. By nightfall, the number of anti-Trump protesters swelled. Soo-yeon and her fellow protesters had watched the president's speech on their phones. This is, after all, South Korea. Everything here is streamed live.
USA!
On the pro-American side of the street,
Mr. Trump!
the feeling was that, if anything, the president should have gone further.
We strongly demand, request, Mr. Donald Trump, please strike North Korea right now. He's thinking about our casualty, but I want to say to him, don't worry, please don't worry, Koreans. We are ready to sacrifice our lives.
Chae-T's son was a lieutenant colonel in the South Korean army. His stance is stoic and simple. Better dead than red. So you're willing to accept the huge costs that a war would cause?
And sacrifice. I may die, which will be fine. Just kill the North Korean Kim Jong-un.
The feeling across the other side of the street was entirely different. Why is he allowed to speak at our parliament, shouted Soo-young. No Trump, no war. By day, Soo-young works as a pharmacist. In Korea, it takes 4 years of medical school on top of a good college education to qualify for the job. She's worked hard to get here, but when we sat down to talk, she sounded downbeat about her future.
We can think about our future. Hey, think about it. If there's we keep our money or we keep our job, we do lots of things for our future, we study hard, but eventually, if there's a war happen, it's nothing.
It all goes away.
We can't imagine our future.
It's a historical irony that the younger generations here who grew up in modern Seoul, one of the richest cities in Asia, are bitter about their future.
I think we lost our own independent power at the global table.
How does that feel?
If Kim Jong-un or Trump decided to make war in Korean Peninsula, there's nothing we can do. It's a crazy thing.
It's not something that you think about, day to day. But yeah, it's always there.
Do they feel like the shadow of death is hanging over them?
Yeah, if it really happens, I'll be dead in 5 minutes, so it's better to not think about it.
Okay. When Soo-young and her friends go out, they don't talk about politics or war. They talk about friends and plans and work. Do you prepare for potential conflict?
Actually, I don't, because if there's a war, it's gonna be a minute or 2 minutes that I have to... There's no option to be alive. It's like we just live only today.
Live in the moment.
No tomorrow for us. We only have this moment.
So when I go out in the street and I see the places happy and buzzing...
Yeah, that's why. We always having concert and go to movies or love each other, but we only concerned about today. That's why, because we're not sure about tomorrow.
One thing everyone we talked to agreed on is that there may be two Koreas, but one people. They long for the day when they can be reunited with their neighbors and relatives on the other side of the border. But the people of North Korea don't get a vote. Only their leader does, Kim Jong-un. So next, we try to figure out what he is all about and why his regime's pursuit of nuclear power may not be as foolish as it sounds. It's easy to dismiss the regime as a caricature. The bad guys in the Team America movie.
I don't have any weapons of mass destruction, okay, Hans?
But it's worth looking past the bizarre cult of personality and the goose-stepping troops and trying to actually understand what the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, might be thinking. Stay with us. It's a sunny Saturday here in Seoul, South Korea, and behind me is the city's ancient southern gate. It's easy to forget on such a lovely day that the front line with North Korea is only 35 miles away. Reporters don't often get access into North Korea, and when we do, our movements are very restricted. So a lot of the time, the only images we get out of Pyongyang are pure, over-the-top propaganda. We are intrigued by the bizarre displays, by the cult of personality, but there may actually be some logic behind the strategy that's kept one family in charge there for 70 years. When you look at the propaganda coming out of North Korea, like the 74-year-old TV announcer who has been there at the desk through all the historic moments. and now regularly returns to deliver the news of new missile launches or of people filled with awe and emotion at the mere sight of their beloved leader. It's easy to dismiss the regime as a caricature, the bad guys in the Team America movie.
I don't have any weapons of mass destruction, okay, Hans?
But it's worth looking past the bizarre cult of personality and the goose-stepping troops and trying to actually understand what the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, might be thinking. It's also worth taking a look at our own history and asking why we would expect North Korea to trust us and come in out of the cold. For years, the North Koreans have been working relentlessly to develop their nuclear program, refusing to back down, no matter how loudly they were threatened.
Once again, North Korea has defied the will of the international community, and the international community will respond.
They would pay a price so great that the nation would probably not survive as it is known today.
The North Koreans just kept on going, ignoring both the American threats and the hardships that the sanctions imposed on the people. Why? Well, it's worth remembering what happened in Libya. In 2003, the leader of Libya agreed to give up that country's biological and chemical stockpiles to the West and abandon its nuclear program before having a bomb.
Leaders who abandon the pursuit of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them will find an open path to better relations with the United States and other free nations.
But only 8 years later, Libya found itself on a far different path. The U.S. and NATO engaged in a bombing campaign to overthrow the dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. In response, North Korea's foreign ministry came out suggesting that the Libyans had been duped into abandoning their nuclear weapons in exchange for a deal with the West. A deal the West did not keep. And more recently, North Korea is observing how the Iranians came to the table, how they signed a deal with the United States and European nations, and almost 2 years after the deal was signed, we are pulling out. So why would the North Koreans fall for what they believe is an American trap? Why would they take our president's invitation to come to the table as anything but a trick? Experts argue that North Korea's nuclear ambitions, its constant testing of missiles, is an insurance policy, a way to make sure that Kim Jong-un stays in power, a way to make sure that the Kim dynasty goes on forever. Why is it important to understand what's going on inside the head of the North Korean leader? Because as President Trump himself has repeatedly stressed this week, there are only two places this crisis can lead: the negotiating table or the battlefield. It's hard to imagine a nuclear war breaking out in the 21st century. But then again, nuclear war is always too horrific to imagine. Next up, Tom Brokaw asks if we're heading for a new nuclear age. Welcome back. The president says that North Korea went ahead and developed nuclear weapons because previous American administrations were not determined enough to stop it. But the big question now is, which side is bluffing? Will the president go to war with a nuclear-armed North Korea, or will Kim Jong-un fire first? The third option, that one of them will back down, is the only one that avoids an all-out war. So the fact is that nuclear war is a possible outcome of this crisis. That idea, which was completely unthinkable just a few months ago, is hard to take in. So for some perspective, I turn to the man who hired me many years ago to work at NBC News, the legendary Tom Brokaw.
August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m.
When the United States dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, Japan, the first atomic bomb used in warfare, and Fat Man 3 days later on Nagasaki, it was the beginning of the nuclear age, an age of such potential destruction it could end life on Earth. Our principal enemy, the Soviet Union, soon had its own nuclear arsenal. And I was one of the American school children diving under desks in a foolish belief that we could survive a Russian attack. As a political science student, I was immersed in the great issue and debates of my generation. Would the United States and Kremlin rivalry lead to a war to end all wars? A 1954 NBC documentary, ominously titled 3, 2, 1, zero, was primetime viewing. The idea that the world would end was not an apocalyptic absurdity. Yet, for all of the fear, no one dared to go nuclear. An uneasy truce settled across the world. Not peace exactly, but a kind of standoff between the Cold War superpowers. It was summed up in the phrase mutually assured destruction. If either side started a war, both would disappear. But for other countries, the temptation to be part of the nuclear club was too great. And in an age of suicide bombers and unstable despots, the idea of mutually assured destruction may no longer keep the handcuffs on. Following World War II, as the nuclear age was getting underway, the United States was involved in a war in Korea, although they called it a police action. 64 years ago, there was a ceasefire. The Korean Peninsula was divided between the North and the South. No one could have known then that today, North Korea would be a major and dangerous nuclear power. Nuclear weapons have spread across the world, large nations and small, China and Europe, Israel, but also Pakistan, India, and of course, North Korea. A bizarre, renegade nation led by a megalomaniacal dictator who plays by no rules except his own. He has developed a sophisticated nuclear delivery system. Will he use it? David Wright is with the Union of Concerned Scientists, a group of experts dedicated to monitoring the perils of the nuclear age.
I started watching the missile program of North Korea back in the early 90s. I've been trying to get people to pay attention to this since then and to really put a lid on it.
What caused all this proliferation? How did that happen?
Other countries start to think, well, what do we need and what are the threats out there and what can we do about them? And that urge is very strong.
What worries Wright and his fellow scientists is that with all of these nukes, what about an accidental launch?
The President of the United States has sole authority to order the launch of nuclear weapons, and nobody in the command system can legally stop that.
It is not just President Trump. How do we develop a fail-safe system so no one person has that authority anywhere? If that nuclear chain begins to go off, no schoolboy desks will be much help in protecting millions of people.
This is one of those surreal moments we get a lot of in Seoul these days. Tom was just laying out the dangers of nuclear warfare, and behind me are dancers in traditional clothing. They've come out for a daily ceremony, and they seem to have an audience. It's a beautiful day here in Seoul, and nothing seems further away than a war. Let's hope it stays that way. Next, we find out that there's far more to North Korea's military machine than rockets and bombs. In a conventional fight, there's no doubt that Americans will own the airspace. But what happens if the fight moves to cyberspace?
On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put the threat level from North Korea?
Definitely somewhere between 8 and 10.
Are we ready for a new kind of war where the front line is actually online? Stay with us. Welcome back to Seoul, South Korea. North Korea, just 35 miles away from here, is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's also the most isolated. Very few people have access to the internet, and those who do are generally high-ranking government officials. And yet, it turns out there's a direct line connecting Pyongyang, North Korea's capital, with the most expensive leak in Hollywood history. One thing the North Korean regime is not known for is a sense of humor. So when Sony Pictures was about to release a movie, The Interview, which used the great leader as a pun in a dirty joke,
President Kim Jong-un,
a weapon was launched. It wasn't a missile or a bomb. Instead, it was a sneak attack.
Remember, in the Sony case, they wiped everyone's computer, and then they left this.
Eric Chen traces down hackers for a living. He's the director of technology and response at Semantic Labs, one of the world's largest internet security companies.
And then they had this scrolling message saying they're going to release all their data to the world. Imagine you come in and you're working at Sony, and tens of thousands of computers across your network are all infected, and they're all displaying this.
Sony's servers had been ransacked. Now, unreleased movies were getting leaked online. Internal emails, personal data, social security numbers, all posted on websites and social media. The attack cost Sony about $42 million. That was back in 2014. Since then, Chen and other security experts have pieced the evidence together. They now believe the so-called Guardians of Peace were none other than a hacking outfit better known as Lazarus.
We believe they're an extremely well-funded, organized group of hackers, basically. Hacking for political reasons, and also we see now for monetary reasons as well.
Lazarus, a shadowy group of hackers, has been closely linked to North Korea. Its members combine attacks on known targets of the regime, like the computer systems in South Korea, with hacking for profit, the digital equivalent of robberies. What digital detectives in the West didn't know was that Lazarus was about to unleash its first global attack.
Now to the massive cyber attack spreading.
WannaCry, a piece of malware that sat dormant in millions of computers around the world, was activated on Friday, May 12th. FedEx, Spain's phone company, Germany's train company, and Britain's National Health Service were just some of the organizations that were hit hard.
Their goal was to cause wide-scale disruption.
What benefit does North Korea get out of that?
You know, it's really unclear. You know, this particular group, all the attacks that we've seen, the one thing that's predictable about them, the one thing that makes sense about them, is simply they're unpredictable.
Here's another thing that makes the group unpredictable. WannaCry wormed its way into millions of computers, but the code was so basic that a 22-year-old hacker from Britain found an easy way to kill it, only 48 hours after it was activated.
This is WannaCry on the right, and this is Contempty on the left, a previous Lazarus piece of software that was used in Bangladesh.
The attack on the Central Bank of Bangladesh was a straight-up bank robbery, cyber style. No guns, no masks, just lines of code. The hackers exploited a small glitch in the global banking system and almost stole $1 billion, except they couldn't spell.
That was the first indication that caused the banks to go, wait a second, why is this transaction being made? And then held up all the rest. Because of a single typo in the organization name in which they were transferring the money to.
They spelled it wrong.
One letter wrong.
It turns out that an attempted global ransom attack for money, an attack on a movie studio, and repeated attacks on South Korea all came from one source. Eric Chen connected the dots and cracked the case.
It's very clear this is all the same group.
So their fingerprints are pretty clear, pretty obvious.
Not only their fingerprints pretty obvious and clear, they likely want people to know.
Because Lazarus, experts around the world now believe, is no criminal outfit. The North Korean government. The U.S. government calls it Hidden Cobra.
What I'm concerned about is that North Korea will decide to show that it can't be cornered. It may feel like it can't launch a missile, but North Korea may calculate that they can cause someone to back off by resorting to cyber attacks.
Robert Silvers was in charge of cyber policy at the Department of Homeland Security under President Obama. He says we can't afford to underestimate the cyber power the isolated nation of North Korea can wield.
People are always surprised because North Korea is such a medieval society in so many ways, and yet they have this sophisticated high-tech capability to hack. But the way they've built that is just the same way that they've also at the same time are on the advanced nuclear capability.
The cyber war has started, and no other country can attack North Korea because there is no point.
Jang Se-yul is a former colonel in the North Korean military who defected before Kim Jong-un came to power. For years, he ran war simulations, working side by side with the country's elite hacking unit, the notorious Bureau 121.
Only the very brightest students get to become hackers. They learn everything about the internet, then they work in the Cyber Research Center, which is directly controlled by the government.
So these hackers are all soldiers. When they go to work in Bureau 121, they're wearing uniforms?
Yes, when they go from home to work, they wear their uniforms. They live in the military, they work for the military.
It may seem that at a time when the North Koreans are showing off their nuclear capabilities and the U.S. is mobilizing enormous military assets, the cyber threat is a minor concern. But keep in mind that North Korea is no match for the U.S. in terms of sheer military force. cyber attacks, like terrorism, are the kind of weapon that can level the playing field.
It's a very asymmetric game here. Imagine that they did something to the U.S. They brought down the power grid with their cyber attack, or they wiped a ton of machines. What is the U.S. going to do in retaliation from a cyber perspective? North Korea doesn't rely on the internet, doesn't rely on all this computing infrastructure. Their financial system isn't built on computers all over the world.
It's one of the only countries in the world that basically isn't online.
That's right. They can do whatever they want and trash computers all over the world. They don't have zero effect to them.
The challenge with North Korea is that there are not that many hacking targets. A cyber shooting war, tit for tat, between the U.S. and North Korea is not where the U.S. wants to have this battle being played out.
Much more exposed.
We have much more to lose. Our entire economy depends on the internet functioning properly. That's not the case for North Korea.
How would you rate their abilities?
You know, interestingly, when we look at them relative to other nation-state attacks that we've seen, they're actually low on the sophistication scale. But their impact has been extremely high.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put the threat level from North Korea?
Definitely somewhere between 8 and 10. You know, the thing about
8 and 10, that's high.
They're just willing to do all kinds of really brazen things.
And launching a cyber attack on our hyper-connected society is much easier than launching a nuclear strike. So please, update your security software. Our national defense may depend on it. You're watching On Assignment with me, Richard Engel. Back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Seoul, South Korea. We've spent many weeks working on the stories we told you this hour, and we're going to keep reporting on them for the foreseeable future. As we said right at the beginning, there is no problem more in need of a solution, no crisis more urgent than the one that is unfolding here. North Korea is now, whether the world is ready to admit it or not, the only reason to ring the alarm bells. Even if you take the nuclear weapons out of the equation, a war here could still cause unthinkable, unacceptable number of casualties. Even in a conventional war scenario, the city behind me will suffer a prolonged, deadly bombardment. It's not just that Koreans are our allies either, though they are. The issue is that this is a conflict we have been involved in for 64 years. We helped build this prosperous, innovative, densely populated country, and we cannot allow it to end up in ruins again. President Trump traveled here this week, bringing the spotlight of world attention with him, trying to work with other countries to solve this crisis, and that has to be a good thing. But the game of chicken he's been playing with Kim Jong-un, the military escalation and the trading of insults, that is a dangerous game. We should all hope that the president is right. We should all hope that Kim Jong-un folds and gives up his nuclear program. Because if he doesn't, if he plays this game to its bitter end, well, I think we've said enough about how dangerous that all could be. Rachel will be back here Monday night. And next Friday, we'll have an exclusive investigation into the president's international businesses. You're not going to want to miss that one. So for now, good night from Seoul.